Well, good day, folks. Thanks for coming to and listening with Finding the Warmth of Our Sun here at Madison 365. I'm Matthew Brown, and I'm your host. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Please hit subscribe. You'll be finding us every Wednesday. So some things might change fast between the time I'm recording this and when this airs on Wednesday, October 7th, and that is the president's health. And President Trump there's a chance he may not survive, right, by the airing of this. So I definitely want to be mindful this could be a bit dated. As really a lot of things, just in general, seem to happen quite fast these days. But I want to speak on the grace and empathy President Trump has been getting from not just many Democrats, but many folks on the left, particularly white folks, I think. This is just anecdotal and observation, seem to be more inclined to publicly wish the president well, right? Not even, you're talking about people that the performance, right, of civility don't have to take part in the performance of all of this, right? Celebrities, TV personalities, news folks down the list, right? Like Rachel Maddow, right? She did a whole segment on this, and it's an interesting happening. Quite interesting. And one that isn't surprising in a lot of sense. One that Black America, in a way, is quite aware of, in the sense that Black Americans that face racialized oppression or face depression, right, a lot of times violent oppression, are oftentimes asked to perform grace, to forgive those that have accosted upon them, and to grant somebody that has committed a horrendous action grace. To forgive them and their individual actions, right? And wanting to heal and move forward or find a place of healing and down the line. Now, I'm not one, and I'm not going to be telling people, and this is not what any of this is about, on how, one, to grieve, and two, to feel, if you truly feel the president well, to vote him out this coming election that's about 30 days away. Go for it. But there's another way to view this, not necessarily one, because there's a middle way, I should say, not necessarily one where you wish him death. And again, I'm not going to judge you if you wish him death either. I don't think that's necessarily wrong to do that, particularly in looking at who this man is. I mean, a lot of you folks that I think might have this gut reaction towards those that wish the president death might have celebrated the assassination of Osama bin Laden, might have celebrated the capture and hanging in whether it's internally or externally of Saddam Hussein, wouldn't have felt bad if somehow, as in your head, as far as somehow the Russians or the Soviets at this point brutally murdered Hitler, right? Which they would have if they found him. Let's be honest about that. Like Mussolini being dragged through the streets, which is not necessarily an action that when taught is instantly not condemned, right? And you might be thinking, well, that's different because these folks were enemies of America. But how much different is it really when you're talking about a president whose intentional actions have led what I would argue to be a genocide of American citizens, with 210,000 Americans dead of COVID through known inaction, through neglect, with his genocide of immigrant and refugee populations in ICE facilities and Department of Homeland Security and border facilities, as we're talking about real human rights violations with horrendous medical practices, particularly on women in, blanking on words, but yeah, destroying their ability to give birth, and other neglect within these facilities, right? That are torturous facilities in real ways. Beyond just the horrendous separation of families. So is this a man that demands empathy and sympathy? And in that turn, prayers or light or love or hope for his health just so you can vote him out. I mean, this is a real fascist, an authoritarian figure who has no care for human life outside of his own. Is that a man that you should hope maintain power any longer than now? And there's an interesting aspect to this, right? The right and conservatives, particularly in the last 20 or so years, have given no real empathy to anybody else that is to the left of them. And some of that is seen in how they view themselves as the real Americans, the true Americans, and view Democrats and particularly liberals in general as traitors to America and effectively race traitors, because there is a real racial element to this, particularly when we look at the demographic makeup of the GOP and how they demand people treat them with their full humanity when they don't return the same. This is also something that echoes a bit from Reconstruction, where former slave owners and Republicans at that point, or I should say Northern leaders, Union leaders at that point, particularly post Abraham Lincoln, kind of really the Andrew Johnson presidency, and fast forward a little bit in time as Reconstruction is failing, there was this want to forgive and forget those that betrayed the United States, that were traitors. Nobody was put on trial in being traitors, and in what effectively led to a war that killed hundreds and thousands of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. A war that was launched to protect the institution of slavery, to create an explicit slave state, to do something what we now know, what we now call as crimes against humanity, and war crimes, effectively, and genocide. These are our modern day terms for these things. What I want to get into is definitely some generalizations here, because this isn't necessarily 100% of the time and isn't necessarily 100% accurate, but it is a good, I think, overarching analysis of this. I wouldn't call it a law of any sort. More of an overarching analysis of trends is what we see of white figures, regardless of the political spectrum, and particularly on the left, wanting to constantly provide civility, humanity towards white figures that are on the right, in such a way that these conservative figures don't necessarily lend to figures on the left, and particularly don't lend to people of color and Black Americans and Indigenous Americans, Latino, and Asians. Asian populations and generalized immigrant populations. Historically, this is a currency of whiteness, and particularly those that fully buy into the ideology of white supremacy, whether consciously or unconsciously, that actively support it, right? That actively support a racialized caste system within this country, demanding that people give them civility that they don't necessarily give others, demanding that they receive humanity that they don't necessarily grant others. And this is effectively part of the lie of America, this civility, this lie of freedom, right? This is something in one of my favorite James Baldwin essays on being white and other lies that he got into. It was written in 1984 and published in Essence, about this kind of crisis of leadership of the white community, the lie of being white and the lie of America. And we'll walk through some of these thoughts here that he wrote down for this. And quote, "The crisis of leadership in the white community is remarkable and terrifying because there is, in fact, no white community. This may seem an enormous statement, and it is. I'm willing to be challenged. I'm also willing to attempt to spell it out. My frame of reference is, of course, America, or that portion of North America, continent that calls itself America. And this means I am speaking essentially of the European vision of the world, and more precisely, perhaps, the European vision of the universe. It is a vision as remarkable for what it pretends to include as for what it remorselessly diminishes, demolishes, or leaves totally out of account. There is, for example, at least in principle, an Irish community, here, there, anywhere, or more precisely Belfast, Dublin, and Boston. There's a German community, both sides of Berlin, Bavaria, and Yorkville. There's an Italian community, Rome, Naples, the Bank of the Holy Ghost, and Mulberry Street. And there's a Jewish community stretching from Jerusalem to California to New York. There are English communities, there are French communities, there are Swedish consortiums, there are Poles in Warsaw, where they would like us to be friends, and in Chicago, where because they are white, we are enemies. There are, for that matter, Indian restaurants and Turkish baths. There is the underworld, the poor, to say nothing of those who intend to become rich, are always with us, but this does not describe a community. It bears terrifying witness to what happened to everyone who got here and paid the price of the ticket. The price was to become white. No one was white before she came to America. It took generations and vast amount of coercion before this became a white community." Now, what he's talking here a bit is kind of about this is the white people have effectively both granted themselves, but this weird paradox of granting themselves the only full humanity while at the same time destroying their humanity in the process in an attempt to take away the humanities of others, taking away their ethnic and cultural heritage. When we see white supremacists talk about Western civilization, they're talking about whites, but then you start digging down into European ethnicities and nationalities, and things get really, really messy when you really actually try to break down this quote unquote Western civilization aspect of things. What they hang on to is this weird ideology of I don't know, ideology is the correct, really the right word I'm looking for, but this weird myth of Rome, right? Again, another slave state of there's a brutal empire that was a heck of a lot more cosmopolitan than people think. And weird sorts of other Nordic mythologies and whiteness that just don't hold up. Like there is no like unity among like whiteness per se. There is like they try to blend in this Western culture, right? And it's very much within the idea of a lot of times, not solely, but a lot of times in the idea of the melting pot of the United States, where a lot of folks gave up some of the core parts of their national and ethnic history and culture to become white in the United States, where they become a sanitized version of this culture. And we see this through a lot of ways. St. Paddy's Day is like that, right? There's no real hard Irish roots yet. It's part of Irish American culture. And a lot of whites don't fully identify or confront the idea that they are white within the United States, and really what that means or what is white culture, how they view white cultures through their own nationalistic and ethnic lens of their Euro national and ethnic background. And he continues, "There has never been a labor movement in this country, proof being the absence of black presence in the so-called father-to-son unions. There are perhaps some Negroes in the window, but blacks have no power in labor unions. Just so does the white community, as a means of keeping itself white, elect as they imagine the political representatives. No nation in the world, including England, is represented by so stunning a pantheon of the relentlessly mediocre. I will not name names, I will leave that to you. But the cowardice, this necessity of justifying a total false identity and of justifying what must be called a genocidal history, has placed everyone now living into the hands of the most ignorant and powerful people the world has ever seen. And how did it get that way? By deciding that they were white, by opting for safety instead of life, by persuading themselves that a black child's life meant nothing compared to a white child's life, by abandoning their children to the things white men could buy, by informing their children that black women, black men, and black children had no humanity, integrity, that those who call themselves white were bound to respect. And in this debasement and definition of black people, they debase and defame themselves, and have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion because they think they are white. Because they think they are white, they do not dare confront the ravage and the lie of their history. Because they think they are white, they cannot allow themselves to be tormented by a suspicion that all men are brothers. Because they think they are white, they're looking for or bombing into existence stable populations, cheerful natives, and cheap labor. Because they think they are white, they believe, as even no child believes, in the dream of safety. Because they think they are white, however vociferous they may be, and however multitudinous they are, as speechless as Lot's wife, looking backward, changed into a pillar of salt. However, white being absolutely a moral choice, for there are no white people. The crisis of leadership for those of us who identify has been forged or branded as black is nothing new. We who are not black before we got here either, who were defined as black by the slave trade, have paid for the crisis of leadership in the white community for a very long time, and have resoundingly, even when we faced the worst about ourselves, survived and triumphed over it. If we had not survived and triumphed, there would not be a black American alive. And the fact that we are still here, even in suffering, darkness, danger, endlessly defined by those who did not dare define or even confront themselves, is the key to the crisis in white leadership. The past informs us of various kinds of people, criminals, adventurers, and saints, to say nothing, of course, of popes, but it is the black condition, and only that, which informs us concerning white people. It is a terrible paradox, but those who believed that they could control and define black people divested themselves of the power to control and define themselves. And we see this quite a bit, and there's some things that I definitely want to bring out within that idea said, by abandoning the children to things white men could buy. This is a sacrifice of capital in some real sense, not just, plopping children down into TVs to raise them, but this idea that you must sacrifice yourself to capital, sacrifice your children to capital. And we see this right now, particularly within the GOP's plan or lack of a plan around COVID, the sacrificing ourselves for capital, this debasement of any people, of all Americans when it comes to sacrificing itself for capital, partly because they also know that this virus disproportionately kills black and brown folks. They are this lie of freedom, this denial of freedom, without really understanding what real freedom is. The freedom not worried about healthcare or going broke because you're sick. The freedom to not worry about childcare, housing, and food access, to not worry if you'll be able to afford supporting your family if you lose your job. Really, the cost of life on the individual, few reap the benefits. It is a death march of capital, of working yourself half to death, not knowing your full meaning, not knowing or understanding yourself, numbing yourself until it is time to die while you afford others the freedom to live, particularly the wealthy. But they aren't really even free in a sense, as they're captives of their own oppression, their own addiction to material gains, right? Well, white people continually sell out their own livelihood to maintain whiteness and white superiority in this country, to maintain a racial caste system, to better put it, within this country. There's a real lost soul of white America, not necessarily knowing who they are. One that is buried in collections of things and capital and property accumulation, one that can effectively take the soul of any American, regardless of color. America's in the soul-taking business. And in one that doesn't confront this, as afraid to look in the mirror as we pacify ourselves and decide to grant civility and humanity, full humanity and full empathy to those that have enacted terrible and horrible things. We just need to look at how we look at our founding fathers, which most were slaves and defended the institution of slavery, even if they didn't necessarily fully even agree with it, still defended and went along with this institution, our upholding of people that have committed genocide, our naming of monuments, of buildings to these folks, as we still continue to grant humanity to horrible, terrible people. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to wish them death, but it also doesn't mean that we have to grant them forgiveness. You can love their full humanity, that will love them, grant them love and compassion in seeing who they are and understanding their own suffering without necessarily wishing them well. I mean, it seems like a paradox, and it kind of is, but multiple things that seem paradoxical can be true at the same time. We know this of ourselves. We know this of a lot of things. And that is the part of humanity where most people aren't solidly good or solidly evil, where shades of gray, where things that you might make one choice that is a loving and kind choice and turn around and make a choice that is terrible and abusive. So these things that are a paradox can be true at the same time. But it is all a crisis of whiteness, of white leadership in a lot of ways. Maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. And something that has defined America in a real sense, in a real way. Why do we hope horrible Americans that have done horrible things well? Should they not have the power that they have to enact these horrible things? By wishing them well, we are giving them power and continuing wanting to not just authorize, but maybe authorize, or not justify their power, right? I'm blanking on the exact word I'm looking for, and I know it'll come to me later, but a lot of folks are horribly broken. We see this in opioid use and alcohol rates and a lot of trauma, where we're asking folks who can't transform themselves to transform a nation, folks that can't provide themselves freedom to provide other people freedom, to ask for our humanity when they just deny themselves a lot of ways their own humanity, their own freedom, the investments in themselves for the sake of being white. So we must heal ourselves in this country. And this becomes complicated as you don't necessarily want to embrace the incivility, the lack of empathy and sympathy that a lot of these folks have. And let's be clear, though, if you're not working and are horrified at 200,000 people dead, you're not one of these folks. If you are trying to create a society where people are truly free, you are not one of these folks, even if you do not wish these folks necessarily well, right? Particularly if they're sick. You don't have to wish their death. You don't have to wish them a horrible life. But why wish them to continue in their seats of power? Why wish them healthy so they can continue in these seats of power? You can grant them an individual empathy without the support. Maybe pray that they find their humanity in some way, shape, or form. But we must continue to fight, and particularly in the face of fascism, which takes advantage in real ways, this want to grant others their humanity, or sympathy is a better word maybe in the situation. These people need to be removed from power. Simple as that. This president should no longer be president. Simple as that. I do not necessarily wish anybody to die from this disease, but I also do not wish President Trump to continue to be in power. You can read at that however you wish, and I will defend that. This man has caused many deaths. He doesn't deserve the power that he has. He doesn't belong in the seat that he's in. And I do not wish to take the chance to leave it up to voters and our quasi-democratic electoral system that has a lot of fault lines to be taken advantage of, manipulated, and changed for this man to stay in power. These people do not deserve it. They do not demand our sympathy or empathy in this sense. Maybe just by being human, we should love them as humans, but beyond that, 200,000 Americans dead. And continuing human rights abuses in detention facilities. That's who these people are. And they do not deserve to continue to destroy what is left of this country's humanity. And I'll leave that there. Thank you for coming. Find us every Wednesday, sometimes covering hard topics and sometimes not necessarily landing on a hard, good, solid thought. All right. These things are tough and ever evolving. So I'll see you next week, next episode. Find the Woman Through Our Sons at YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. Thanks for coming, and well, hope you're learning and pulling something from this and challenging yourself. And I think that's the biggest thing, is just, I hope to challenge people to work through hard thoughts and emotions and ideas that have perpetually diminished or perpetually undercut the possibility of the people residing in this nation from realizing its full potential and its full humanity and fully embracing each other in community. And sometimes to do that, we have to reject those that reject those core ideas. Thanks for coming, and I hope you have a good week. Mask up, stay safe, socially distance. Things are getting rough out there in Madison, Dane County, and in Wisconsin with COVID. So please, please, please be smart and look out for each other in this. I mean, really look out for each other and take it upon ourselves to grant each other the freedom of a lot of things that we are denied in our society. So take care, stay safe, and best wishes and much love. Have a good week, folks.
This is 365 Media.